I presented with you, since I'm here in Gettysburg hanging out, I presented you guys with this idea of generational shadows that I was noticing by doing some inner shadow work myself and trying to figure out some aspects of what was holding me back. Because I've started to reach a plateau in my career of what is the next step? What is the next thing? And how do I think about the next thing to do? And I realized recently, I'm up in Rochester, New York. We have a studio space there, my wife and I, and we had some people come through that were sort of asserting themselves in a way that I realized made me feel very uncomfortable. And it happened multiple times. It was probably 5 or 6 times in a row. And I realized that there was this discomfort, this deep discomfort, almost a dangerous feeling. Like these people are dangerous. And I had this this triggered manic response to these people, just this intensity that I was just like, why am I so worked up? Why am I trying to move the chess pieces of people around these people to like make sure that they're safe? There was something that just made me feel like something was off. And so I had to do some inner exploration at some point. I kept talking to my wife about it, and she was just asking me the questions of like, well, what's going on with you? Because we talk about triggers and shadows and all of these things all the time. And when there's a trigger or I'm referencing or recognizing a shadow within myself, I can only notice a behavior because it's something I'm aware of or something that exists within me. Or at least that's my ethos. So I started to approach this idea of, what did this person represent? They represented kind of a visionary in a sense. They've someone that gave themselves permission to do what they wanted, to assert themselves. And I was realizing that I just didn't have that in myself. And so part of the exploration and discovery of that was in the book Generations, as you could see behind you on the shelf. Generations and The Fourth Turning. I read The Fourth Turning, and I was trying to figure out what were the circumstances in life that led up to my existence. Like, what made my parents make the choices that they made? What made me start to make the choices that I made? Not in a sort of blaming, outsourcing my responsibility kind of way, but there are nodes in my life that led to my existence that have influenced me and led to some of the automaticity that I was doing. Like having a trigger and a response is an automaticity. It's something that my nervous system is responding to that I'm like, okay, what is this? It's a signal. It's telling me something. So I wanted to present this to you and start talking a little bit about generational shadows, because to me, that's not just me. I've noticed in many of my millennial brethren that there is a tamping down of authority. There is a non-committalness. There is a lack of desire to stand out and speak up for yourself in favor of the social realm or making everyone feel equal and feel connected and all of that.
So we're going to get into a lot of this, but there's somebody watching or listening right now that this is an aha for this person, because just the idea of, I have people in my world that come into my world and I feel threatened and triggered. And for you to make the shift, Christian, of saying, oh man, it's their fault. They're doing something. They're making me, I've got to protect. I've got to defend. And your wife, Molly, you guys had this conversation. She's like, okay, what is this saying about you though? What's being drawn up for you in the trigger? What are you feeling through? What's coming up for you? What does this say about your systems running and how you approach the world? And you going, yeah, I am going to tune to that. What does this say about me? I can't control everything in the outer world, but this is a moment of reflection for myself. And just that alone, if somebody's listening right now, I think that's a huge reframe for them. Maybe they haven't thought of that before. Maybe that's something that's like a new concept to them. Now, some people listening right now, they're beyond that. They've already gone through that process, but that's a significant thing in most of our lives when that moment happens for us.
Yeah. And some of that started by wanting to see beyond blaming my parents for my programming, because I think that's another thing like I've seen a lot of my millennial brethren doing, is looking at our parents and blaming them. But there are nodes in systems that have led to their behaviors and their reactions. And it's just a continual cycle. And I think you've talked about on previous podcasts about generational theory, that it's cycles, and really resting into the idea that these are cycles. And so for me, getting to know that helped me ease up on the aggressive attacking of my parents or of older generations or anyone else that wasn't me handling my own situation. So I have some stuff that I can share and go through.
How old are you though, first?
I'm 37.
Okay, so you're fully a millennial. You feel like
1985. I'm kind of in the later, I feel like 1982 to 1986 is sort of this this cusp, this transition. So there's aspects of me that relates to the Gen X ethos in some ways. I mean, I watch Stranger Things and I'm like, yeah, I remember that like plenty of aspects of my childhood that had some of those things in there.
Yeah.
But more so resonate with the millennial. So I feel like I'm kind of in this weird sort of cuspy bridge area, which I think lends to some ability to speak to this.
Yeah. And just to clarify the context, we've been talking about generational theory. A couple of weeks ago, we put out multiple podcasts about generational theory and talked about it through the lens of the cycles and the seasons and some of the archetypes. And we've also been talking a lot about Jungian shadows over the last year. And like you said, you are the video editor for our podcast, and so you've been hearing a lot of these things.
Yep.
And so what I hear you saying is that as you were listening to some of these podcasts and as you were also doing your own research into generational theory, you were noticing that some of the triggers you were experiencing with other people were almost like generational theory was shining a light on some of this. And because you have a brilliant INTP mind, you were taking some of these different aspects of the systems that we talk about. And we also have offline conversations all the time around this stuff, because we all geek out about systems, and we all geek out about, all these different theories and models. And so you were noticing that the triggers that you were experiencing around some of the people entering your life were also, you just mentioned, being mirrored in people in your same generation. And so we've had conversations offline, and which is one of the reasons why we wanted to pop you on and be like, okay, so let's talk about these concepts, because you had some real insight, not just into being of the millennial generation and watching your shadows and seeing them mirrored back in, like you mentioned, your brethren, but also other generations having their own share of shadows, like the things they're getting triggered by. And so just to create some clarity, what we're going to talk about in this particular episode isn't just generational theory. It's how this theory can shine a light on some of the things that we're collectively blind to based on assumptions about how reality works, based on the time periods in which we were born, based on our generation, effectively.
Yeah, it's looking at cultural shadows and just taking kind of the principles of how we look at our individual shadow, right? When we're looking at individual shadow, it's our shadow can be represented by what we're triggered by, essentially. Like you look in them, it's a mirror, it's a psyche to psyche experience. We talked about that before on the podcast. And if you're able to witness someone else doing something that you have pushed down because you've deemed it bad for you, or it's not getting your needs met, then that gets put into the shadow. Now, I've heard a representation of the shadow being referred to as the heavy bag you drag behind you, that every time you deem something bad for yourself, your ego essentially, I feel like, is a junction point and decides whether something gets put into the positive, into the persona, something I want to present to people, or it gets put into our shadow, something we don't want people to see about ourselves. It doesn't disappear. We put it into that heavy bag we carry behind us, and it drags us along. And part of me personally wanting to do shadow work is being ready in my life, having done other personal work, to be able to now look at some things that used to obviously be bad when you were a kid, and now look at it and say, like, I'm an adult now. I have sovereignty. I pay my own bills. Like, there are things I don't have to keep carrying in this bag anymore. I can evaluate it, and then I can eventually figure out how to let it go. So that was some of the impetus for some of the searching of this, and realizing that there is, it's the desire to seek out more triggers. It just happened to be that this one was an unexpected one, and it was a big one. Yeah. So it really stuck out. And then I feel like it correlates to taking this principle of the mirror and looking at it from a generational perspective of one big old generational mirror and what tends to trigger a generation.
I'm going to give a little bit of orientation here. So if you're a new listener or you have not heard the episodes we just recently released around generational theory, I recommend you go and listen to those, because we lay out the theory of generations go through a season roughly of about 80 years. There's 4 seasons in that giant season. It's called a saeculum, technically. So there's 4 smaller seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter. And different generations are born into each of those seasonal cycles in an 80-year span called a saeculum. And then each generation almost has an archetypical energy it brings forth. And there's 4 generational archetypes that cycle through. There's the prophet who speaks forth things into the world. There's the nomad taking their tools with them and figuring things out, hacking things together. There is the hero generation, going to save the world and show up in a dominant way to save the day. And then there's the artists who come and sing the songs of previous generations and help us create a new world and new understandings and new art forms and new expression. And then they cycle through over and over again. And so we talked about our generations, millennials, boomers, Gen Xers, Gen Z, silent, all of these, and greatest generation from, my grandparents' generation, where they map on those different archetypes. So if you haven't heard those episodes, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to be you're going to have to struggle to keep up because we're not going to cover all of that ground again. We're going to go into another layer of it, which is the shadows of each of these generations, specifically the names, the current names. Like Gen X is the current nomadic generation archetypically, but we're going to talk about Gen X as Gen X and then maybe some of the nomad shadow. And then the second thing is this may be difficult material. Like as you were telling me some of the concepts, some of your ideas around my generation, I wouldn't say I was getting triggered, but I was definitely resistant. I was like, that can't be, everything felt so tenuous already. Like there's so much to do. If I bring some of that shadow thinking, it's going to undermine everything I want to do in my life and our generation. And so I watched myself be very resistant to some of the ideas you brought forward. But as we were talking and I sat with them, I'm like, it's probably pretty true. Like some of this stuff is probably pretty accurate. And so you listening, I'm going to ask you to do what I'm going to do. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to set aside anything that could be either triggering or difficult or resistant. Approach it with curiosity. I want to hear some of these ideas. Let's talk about them.
Yeah, let me quickly define a trigger, or at least how I look at what a trigger is.
Sure.
It's a heightened activation of our senses or nervous system. That's at least how I personally experienced it. Being put on alert in some sort of way. There's a sense of danger, like I mentioned, like these few people that came into my life, I felt a sense of something is dangerous. And especially at its most extreme repression of something that's very important. And that's part of it. It's like a lot of these are really important integration that a lot of us need to do. So there's also 2 different kinds of triggers. There's a defensive trigger that activates our automaticity, that activates an automatic response, that has this sense of, this is bad. This is a specific narrative that I've heard before. I don't want to get indoctrinated into it, or I don't think this is a great idea, or this is going to make me upset. And there's almost like a panic and just want to get it away as fast as possible. That's more of the defensive trigger. And then there's a growth trigger. And the growth trigger is more of an open response. So if you think of a defensive trigger, it's almost like walking past a mirror and then you slightly see a reflection of yourself at the corner of your eye and you think it's someone else. And it's like kind of scares you. It startles you, right? If you keep looking at the side of your eye, you're going to think it's somebody else and you're just going to ignore it. And you're going to be like, that's some other person doing some other thing. But if you turn and look at the mirror and you start examining yourself and you're like, oh, that is me. What's going on there? Like, why was I scared of that? That's just me. Or that's something reflected that I can actually own about myself. It's sort of with our physical attributes sometimes. It's like you have maybe a certain size of nose and you need to accept that that's just what it's going to be for a while, unless you do surgery. But the idea being that there are defensive triggers and there are growth triggers, and we're asking for you listening to be in an open frame as best as you can, or to notice if you get activated into a defensive trigger, to just notice that, because we're not here to get you. We're not here to trick you.
Well, Antonia might be, but you and me, Christian, aren't.
Yeah, you guys are good people.
We're good people.
It's me you have to look out for.
Yeah.
So